Night settles slowly over the ruins of a once crowded square in western Czechoslovakia, the kind of fading light that turns broken glass into dull embers and smoke into drifting ribbons across the stone. It is May 1945. The war is ending, but its ending is not gentle. The air holds the chill of a world shifting violently from occupation to liberation, from terror to revenge. In the center of the square, under the watchful gaze of hundreds, a line of German women, some in wrinkled auxiliary uniforms, some in civilian dresses, all with dirt streaking their faces, are pushed forward by local partisans. Their hands tremble. The cries of the crowd grow louder. A pair of rusty shears glints as it is raised into the air. The first woman's hair falls in a rough, uneven clump to the ground. She shuts her eyes, but the noise refuses to fade. Shame does not permit silence. These moments, captured in fragments of film and scattered testimonies, would become among the most unsettling images of the war's aftermath. The humiliation of German women, whether civilians accused of collaboration or female auxiliaries taken prisoner, did not unfold as a single planned event, but rather as a widespread phenomenon fed by rage, grief, and the collapse of old authorities. In France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the newly advancing Soviet-held territories, scenes like this erupted with raw public emotion. Some women had been attached to German units as typists, radio operators, or nurses. Others had been lovers, companions, or simply accused of showing sympathy to the occupiers. In many places, they were classed as collaborators before anyone checked their stories. The war had lacerated the European continent, and its wounds were open and bleeding. The cameras, when present, recorded only the external violence, the scissors ripping through braids, the shorn heads pushed forward for inspection, the jeering crowds. But behind each of these scenes was a landscape shaped and scorched by 6 relentless years of war. By the time the Allies reached German-occupied regions in 1944 and 1945, the idea of retribution had already taken root. Occupied nations had endured deportations, executions, starvation, and forced labor. They had watched neighbors disappear. They had seen their streets become battlegrounds. And many believed that those who had worked with the occupier must be punished publicly, visibly, symbolically. The cutting of hair was not a new practice. Its meaning ran deeper than the war itself. Across Europe, shaving a woman's head had long been a punishment reserved for those accused of violating social, moral, or national boundaries. Hair symbolized dignity, identity, femininity. Removing it was an act meant to degrade, to mark, to shame. But in 1944-45, the symbolism took on a darker dimension. The war had blurred the lines between justice and vengeance. Crowds wanted to reclaim control, to publicly undo the humiliation they had endured. And so, in many liberated towns, they turned toward the women who had walked alongside the occupiers. Yet among those crowds of German women, there were also female POWs auxiliaries from the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and SS who had surrendered with the collapsing German front. The final years of the war had seen a sharp increase in the number of German women in support roles. They worked as telephone operators, clerks, meteorologists, translators, medics, drivers, and signal personnel. They were trained to serve the machinery of the German military, not to fight. Many of them believed surrender would grant them formal prisoner of war status. But in several liberated regions, they found themselves treated not as regular POWs, but as collaborators or symbols of the German war machine. The ruins around them bore witness to the emotional landscape they were entering. Buildings blackened from artillery barrages, streets littered with shell casings, families standing near mass graves. This was the world that greeted the surrendering women. And in such a world, distinctions between uniformed auxiliaries and willing collaborators often collapsed under the weight of rage. In France, the practice became known as l'épuration sauvage, the wild purge. It erupted spontaneously in hundreds of towns between the summer of 1944 and the spring of 1945, while most women targeted There were French accused of aiding German soldiers. The humiliations quickly extended to German female personnel captured in the final battles of liberation. In Czechoslovakia, the expulsions and reprisals in May 1945 swept up tens of thousands of German women, many of whom were detained and forcibly shorn before being deported. In Poland and Soviet-occupied zones, the treatment was often harsher, and the line between POW status and civilian status remained blurred. Soviet soldiers, brutalized by years of German occupation, rarely distinguished between combatant and non-combatant. For them, the mere presence of a German uniformed male or female evoked memories of villages destroyed and families killed. Thus, the humiliation of female prisoners became part of the broader collapse of order. Allied commands struggled to impose discipline, but in those chaotic first days after liberation, passions moved faster than military police. The war was ending, but the violence of the war did not obey the calendar. Surrender did not erase the emotions of occupation. And so, as news of Germany's defeat spread, the scissors kept moving. Smoke still curled upward from the towns the German army had abandoned. The roads were filled with refugees, women pushing carts, soldiers returning home, orphaned children searching for food. Somewhere in that uncertain landscape, German female auxiliaries marched into captivity with their uniforms torn, their insignias confiscated, and the knowledge that the world now saw them as extensions of a collapsing empire the moment their hair was taken, was not just a physical act. It was a symbol of their fall from the structured, disciplined hierarchy of the German war machine into the chaos of defeat. And as the scissors clicked, as the hair fell, as the crowds shouted, the women felt something else falling away, the illusion that the war was something distant, something happening on maps or in offices. Now it was happening to them. Their humiliation marked the beginning of a new reality, one shaped by rubble, resentment, and reckoning, the humiliation. Though deeply personal to each woman, was part of a larger story, one that moved outward, into towns still smoldering from battle and nations trying desperately to reclaim dignity. And from this moment of raw, public retribution, the story widens into the world that produced it. To understand how these scenes of humiliation emerged, these squares filled with shouting crowds, these lines of German women forced forward beneath a banner of vengeance, we must step back into the shifting world that existed beneath the surface of Europe in 1944 and 1945. The collapse of the Third Reich did not come suddenly. It came in fractures and waves, and the slow realization that a war begun with conquest would end in ruin. As the Allied armies advanced from the west, the Soviets pressed from the east, and the Axis front lines disintegrated. Millions of German soldiers, auxiliaries, and civilians were caught in the tightening grip of defeat. The environment in which German women eventually faced public retribution was one shaped by desperation, fear, and the unraveling of an order that had once seemed absolute. By the end of 1944, the German war machine had begun to devour its own illusions. The once fearsome Wehrmacht was now fragmented, its divisions hollowed out by casualties on both fronts. The Allied landings in Normandy had opened a corridor that steadily widened into occupied France and Belgium. The Red Army's massive summer offensive operation Begression had annihilated Germany's Army Group Center and driven Soviet forces into Poland. Inside Germany, shortages of manpower led to a rapid expansion of auxiliary roles for women. Thousands were recruited into the Helfer-Korps, the women's auxiliary service attached to the Wehrmacht. Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine, and SS, they trained as typists, clerks, radio operators, code specialists, medical support staff, and communication personnel. Although not combat soldiers, they worked at the very nerve centers of German military operations. As the front lines collapsed, many of these women were stationed in territories that had endured years of harsh occupation. The resentment simmering beneath the surface was vast. Forced labor programs, mass executions, deportations, and terror campaigns had turned entire regions into landscapes of trauma. When Allied troops liberated towns that had been under German rule, civilians stepped out from behind years of repression. The sight of German uniforms, no matter who wore them, became a spark that ignited long-suppressed fury. In France, the German presence had been particularly visible. German female auxiliaries staffed headquarters in Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, and smaller garrison towns. Their uniforms made them unmistakable symbols of the occupying force. Resistance networks had grown steadily stronger in the final years of the war, and with liberation came a desire to reclaim national pride. Between June 1944 and early 1945, an estimated 20,000 women in France were subjected to public head shaving as a form of punishment for collaboration. Not all were German, but many were. The auxiliaries captured during the retreat from Normandy or during the collapse of German positions at the Marne found themselves judged not by military code but by communities that had lived under the shadow of the swastika. In Czechoslovakia, tensions were equally volatile. The German occupation beginning in 1939 had brought forced Germanization, repression of Czech culture, and severe crackdowns on dissent. As German forces withdrew in 1945, auxiliary women working in communication centers, field clinics, and administrative offices attempted to escape with retreating units. Many were captured by partisans emboldened by the imminent arrival of Soviet troops. The expulsions that followed, the violent transition when millions of ethnic Germans were forced out of Czechoslovakia, swept up not only long-settled German civilians but also female POWs who had served the military apparatus. Their humiliation was part of a larger national cleansing, an attempt to physically and symbolically remove traces of the German presence. In Poland and the Soviet Union, memories of occupation were fresh and excruciating. Entire villages had been wiped out. Families had been deported to concentration camps or forced labor. The advancing Red Army carried a deep, ingrained hatred for anything associated with German authority. When Soviet units captured female auxiliaries, especially those attached to SS communications, intelligence centers, or logistics, they often treated them as participants in the atrocities committed by German forces. Soviet military discipline, though firm on paper, could not entirely restrain soldiers who had seen their homeland burned and their families murdered. Reports from these regions documented not only humiliation but arrests, mass detentions, and forced labor assignments. The international legal framework surrounding POW treatment offered little protection in these chaotic weeks. Germany had signed the Geneva Convention of 1929, but many of the occupying or liberating forces, particularly local resistance groups and civilian militias, did not operate within its constraints. Female auxiliary staff, while technically non-combatants, wore military uniforms and served within the structure of the German armed forces. To enraged civilians, they were not secretaries or radio operators. They were the face of the regime that had darkened their towns, occupied their homes, and claimed their loved ones. The Allied military administrations attempted to bring order to the liberated territories, but the geography of revenge stretched faster than their authority. In many regions, the first days of liberation were marked by spontaneous acts of retribution. Crowds gathered wherever German prisoners were brought. Women, whether auxiliaries or accused collaborators, were often placed at the forefront of these rituals because their humiliation carried a symbolic weight. Public shaming reaffirmed the community's moral order, reversing the power dynamic of occupation. A woman's hair, long associated with dignity and femininity, became a tool in these public dramas. Cutting it was a visible erasure, a stripping away of identity, a punishment that lingered long after the scissors stopped. At the same time, German military intelligence units and retreating commands were aware of these growing dangers. As early as March 1945, German officers issued warnings about the treatment their personnel might face if captured in territories hostile to German rule. Female auxiliaries were instructed to remain with their units at all costs, to avoid straying into civilian areas, and to surrender only to uniformed Allied soldiers rather than partisans or civilians. But these orders meant little once the front disintegrated. In many cases, the women were cut off, their communication posts overrun, their escape routes blocked. They surrendered wherever they could to Soviet units, to Czech militias, to French resistance fighters, to civilians who had picked up abandoned rifles. The geopolitical environment surrounding their humiliation was one shaped by collapsing authority and rising emotion. The war had left nations bleeding, starving, disoriented. Across Europe, streets lined with rubble were matched by hearts lined with resentment. The shift from occupation to liberation did not erase trauma. It released it. And as German women soldiers, auxiliaries, civilians walked into this world, they carried on their shoulders not only their own actions, but the burden of representing a regime that had brought devastation across a continent. Their presence in the squares of liberated towns symbolized the fall of a power that once seemed unstoppable, and their treatment in those first hours of captivity mirrored the volatile environment of a Europe trying to reclaim itself. The phenomenon of German female prisoners being publicly humiliated cannot be understood without stepping inside the lives of the individuals who stood at the center of these events. To see the full picture, we must move beyond the squares filled with shouting crowds and look closely at the human beings who experienced this moment, not only the German women, but also those who captured them, judged them, or witnessed their humiliation. War magnifies every human emotion, and the end of war magnifies them still further. On one side, there was fear, confusion, and shame. On the other, there was rage, vengeance, and a desperate hunger for moral restoration. Each perspective reveals a different layer of the event. For the German women, whether auxiliaries in uniform or civilians, swept up in the chaos, the experience of surrender carried an immediate, overwhelming uncertainty. Many of them were young, barely in their 20s, drafted into service in the final years of the war when manpower shortages forced the Nazi regime to rely more heavily on female labor. They staffed switchboards in command bunkers, typed orders transmitted from Berlin, and relayed radio messages from the front. The war they participated in was not fought with rifles, but with documents, cables, and encrypted signals. Yet they were still part of the German military structure, and this affiliation placed them in the line of fury when liberation arrived. Human accounts from these women reveal confusion more than defiance. Many had expected formal processing, interrogation, and transport to POW camps in accordance with military protocol. Instead, they found themselves thrust into the hands of civilians who had endured years of repression. Some auxiliaries recalled being marched into crowded squares, surrounded by crowds who had once walked past them silently in occupied towns but now shouted insults, threw stones, or spat in their direction. Others remembered the sudden ripping away of their military insignias, the tearing of their uniforms, and the cold click of scissors as their braids were severed without warning. For many, the humiliation was not only physical but psychological, the realization that they were no longer protected by the powerful institution that had given them purpose, discipline, and status. Now they were symbols of a defeated empire. And symbols are rarely treated gently. To the civilians who participated in these rituals, however, the moment carried an entirely different emotional weight. Their perspective was shaped by years of occupation, years marked by fear, silence, and the ever-present threat of arrest or execution. They had watched German troops take over their towns, seen neighbors forced onto trains, and lived under curfews and rationing enforced by German authority. Every uniform, whether worn by a male soldier or a female auxiliary, represented the machinery of oppression. Their suffering did not distinguish between the roles of those who served the regime. For many, the humiliation of German women was not simply an act of vengeance. It was a reclaiming of agency after years of powerlessness. Communities that had been silenced finally had a voice, and they used it loudly. In France, where the ritual of shaving women's heads became most widespread, civilians viewed the act as a necessary cleansing. Women accused of horizontal collaboration or of working for German offices had violated not only national loyalty but social norms. Their hair, symbolic of femininity and desirability, became a visible representation of their supposed betrayal. Removing it was a public statement. The nation was purging itself of shame. In Czechoslovakia, The humiliation often unfolded as part of a larger process of expulsion. Ethnic tensions between Germans and Czechs had existed long before the war, but the occupation deepened every wound. When German rule collapsed, years of resentment erupted into violence. For Czech civilians, the act of shorn heads carried the message that the old hierarchy had been overturned. Women who had once walked confidently through towns wearing German uniforms were now at the mercy of the people they had once overseen. Their public humiliation restored a sense of balance in communities shattered by repression. Then there were the partisans, the irregular fighters, resistance members, and armed civilians who, in many regions, became the first to capture German women. From their perspective, these auxiliaries were not clerks or telephone operators. They were components of a military occupation that had executed their comrades, burned their villages, and attempted to extinguish their cultural identity. Partisans had lived in forests and underground shelters, hunted by German patrols. Many had lost family members to German reprisals. When they seized German women fleeing collapsing positions, they saw not individuals but uniforms, objects that had represented terror for years. From a tactical standpoint, the humiliation also had a psychological function. It marked the captured women physically, signaling to the community that they posed no further threat. A shorn head made escape nearly impossible and assimilation among civilians unthinkable. In regions still racked by chaos, such symbolism mattered. It helped partisans maintain control, discourage German collaborators from resurfacing, and demonstrate that the occupation's power had crumbled. The public nature of the punishment ensured maximum visibility, a reminder that the rules had changed. Leadership perspectives differed sharply depending on the occupying force. Allied commanders, American, British, and Canadian, generally tried to suppress spontaneous civilian reprisals. Their goal was to restore order, maintain discipline, and uphold the laws of war. They preferred formal arrest, classification, and transfer of female posts rather than public humiliation. When American officers encountered head-shaving rituals, they often intervened, dispersing crowds and taking custody of the women. Their concern was not sympathy for the prisoners, but control over the volatile atmosphere of post-liberation towns. Soviet leadership, by contrast, operated under a harsher conception of justice shaped by immense wartime losses. Stalin's directives emphasized the destruction of the German military structure and the neutralization of anyone connected to it. Female auxiliaries were considered part of that structure. Soviet troops, hardened by years of brutal combat, viewed German women through the lens of suffering inflicted on the Eastern Front. Their treatment of female prisoners reflected both military policy and personal grief. From the Soviet perspective, humiliation was an expected consequence of German aggression. Morally, these events occupy an uneasy place in history. They raise questions about justice and revenge, guilt and innocence, responsibility and survival. Many German women subjected to these punishments had not committed direct crimes. Some had been conscripted. Others simply worked in administrative roles. Yet they were punished not for individual actions but for their association with the occupying force. Their humiliation forces us to confront a truth about war. When societies emerge from trauma, their desire for retribution often overrides their capacity for measured judgment. And yet, from the viewpoint of the occupied populations, these punishments were not merely acts of cruelty. They were statements of identity, of reclamation, of breaking free from years of powerlessness. For them, the humiliation of German women represented the symbolic end of the Reich's dominance, a public disavowal of the shame and fear they had endured. Between these perspectives lies the complexity of history. The German women trembling under the scissors, the crowd shouting with pent-up rage, the partisans acting as arbiters of justice, the Allied officers seeking order. Together, their experiences form a mosaic of human emotion: fear, anger, guilt, relief, vengeance, intertwined in the final, violent unraveling of a war that had consumed a continent. The decisive moments of this phenomenon did not unfold in a single hour or on a single day. Instead, they erupted repeatedly across Europe in the tense, chaotic weeks surrounding the collapse of Nazi Germany. Yet each eruption shared common elements: a breaking point in the community, a crowd driven by years of grief, a group of captured German women marked as representatives of the defeated occupier, and the razor-sharp moment when humiliation became a public ritual. These scenes were not accidents of history. They were the result of a continent struggling to reclaim control after 6 years of being stripped of it. And in those defining moments, the dynamics of power shifted with a force as sudden and irreversible as the snip of a blade closing around a strand of hair. In the first days of May 1945. As German resistance crumbled across Czechoslovakia, Soviet and Czech partisan units streamed into towns that had endured brutal occupation since 1939, villages burned, supply lines collapsed, and thousands of German auxiliaries and civilian staff attempted to flee with retreating Wehrmacht units. When they were captured, the tension in these liberated towns reached its breaking point. Witness accounts describe how partisans herded groups of German women, some still in uniform, others dressed hurriedly in civilian clothes, into central squares filled with villagers emerging from hiding. The decisive instant came not when the women were seized, but when the crowd recognized them. Uniforms that had once commanded obedience now signaled vulnerability. The power dynamic reversed in an instant. A similar pattern unfolded in France during the summer and autumn of 1944, when Allied troops pushed the Germans out of Normandy and moved toward Paris. The French resistance surged into the open. Towns that had endured years of collaboration, coercion, and silent suffering suddenly became arenas of public reckoning. German female auxiliaries captured during the retreat. Telephonists, clerks, Luftwaffe signal operators were brought to town centers alongside French women accused of fraternizing with German soldiers. The decisive moment came when the crowds demanded not execution nor imprisonment, but degradation. Head shaving, an age-old ritual of dishonor, became the chosen punishment because it carried a message that pierced deeper than physical violence. It was a public erasure of identity, a stripping of dignity, a reminder that their presence had marked a violation of national purity. The ritual followed a similar choreography across regions. The captured women were forced to stand or kneel before the crowd. Partisans or local men, often armed, stood behind them as both executioners of shame and guardians of the moment. The blade or scissors was raised. The crowd surged forward. A chant or a jeer rose into the air. Then came the decisive action. The blade closed, the first lock of hair fell, and the humiliation became irreversible. In some towns, the shaving was uneven and brutal. In others, methodical and deliberate. Many women were left with ragged patches, their scalps exposed like open wounds. The cutting was not simply punishment. It was spectacle. The decisive turning point in these events was not merely the act of shaving, but the transformation it triggered in both the victims and the observers. For the German women, the moment their hair fell away was the moment they understood that the war was truly lost, not only militarily, but socially, psychologically, and personally. The institution they had served, willingly or unwillingly, no longer existed to protect them. Their uniforms offered no safety, their insignias no authority. Their humiliation symbolized the total collapse of the Reich's power structure. For the communities watching, the moment represented liberation not only from German occupation, but from the fear that had governed their lives. The act of cutting a woman's hair might seem minor compared to the immense violence of the war. Yet, in that decisive moment, it carried immense symbolic weight. The people reclaiming their town squares were not soldiers. They were civilians who had lived under terror, often silently. Now, with the occupiers defeated, their hands became instruments of justice or vengeance depending on one's perspective. The ritual allowed them to express the accumulated rage and humiliation of years. It served as a symbolic overturning of the foreign power that had dictated their existence. In Soviet-occupied zones, the decisive moments took on an even harsher dimension. When Red Army troops entered East Prussia, Silesia, and Pomerania, They encountered not only German male soldiers, but also large numbers of female auxiliaries. Many of these women worked in communications posts that facilitated German operations on the Eastern Front. Their presence in these roles led Soviet soldiers to associate them with the destruction inflicted by German forces across the USSR. Thus, when captured, they faced collective punishment. In several documented cases, they were lined up in village squares, ordered to remove their insignias, and forcibly shorn. For Soviet troops, the moment was not simply humiliation but symbolic retribution, a reversal of the terror inflicted by German units on Soviet civilians. Tactically, there was also a practical element to these decisive moments. A shorn head disabled a woman's ability to blend into the population. With so many displaced persons, refugees, and prisoners moving across Europe in 1945, identification was difficult. Shaved hair marked German women unmistakably, reducing the risk of escape or infiltration. But practicality was secondary to symbolism. The cutting of hair was a performative act, meant to solidify the collapse of German authority and demonstrate that the people long silent now wielded power, the leadership. Perspectives during these decisive moments reveal the contrast between local emotion and military order. Allied command structures, particularly American and British, viewed the acts of public humiliation as disruptions to post-liberation stability. Reports from the Office of Military Government in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands describe officers stepping in to halt crowds, separating prisoners from civilians and demanding formal processing. In many cases, the decisive moment ended abruptly when Allied MPs arrived, dispersing the mob and taking custody of the women. Yet these interventions often came too late. The humiliation had already occurred, sometimes recorded on film or captured in photographs that would later become lasting symbols of the war's final days. Psychologically, the decisive moment revealed the trauma embedded in both sides. For the German women, the stripping of their hair created an existential rupture. They had been trained to believe in order, discipline, and hierarchy. Public humiliation demolished those foundations. Many described the moment as more devastating than imprisonment itself. Their humiliation was not private but communal, not temporary but lasting. For the communities administering the punishment, the moment represented catharsis, a way to reclaim dignity stolen by years of occupation. Yet, in the moral landscape of history, these decisive moments occupy a space of discomfort. They highlight the fine line between justice and vengeance, between symbolic acts of liberation and acts of cruelty committed under the guise of freedom. The decisive instant when the blade closed on a woman's hair was not merely a gesture of national purification, but a reminder that war leaves behind wounds that do not heal neatly. And from these raw, irreversible acts of humiliation, the world moved toward a new phase one, where the immediate consequences of these punishments would ripple across the shattered remnants of a defeated Germany. The immediate consequences of these public humiliations unfolded across Europe with a force that mirrored the chaos of the collapsing Third Reich. As German women auxiliaries, civilians and accused collaborators emerged from the squares with shorn heads. Their identities transformed instantly. What had once been a symbol of authority, discipline, or simple femininity had been stripped away in a matter of minutes. The war's end was supposed to bring clarity, but for these women, it ushered in a period of uncertainty, confinement, and stigma so deep that its effects would echo long after the last battle ceased. The humiliation was not the end of their ordeal. It was the beginning of a new chapter marked by captivity, displacement, and profound psychological trauma. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, women who had been publicly shamed were typically taken immediately into custody by local authorities or allied military police. The shaving ritual marked them for the next stage of processing. For some, this meant interrogation by intelligence officers who sought to determine the extent of their collaboration with German forces. Those who had served in auxiliary units were questioned about their postings, responsibilities, and any knowledge they possessed of German communications or operational plans. Many found themselves transferred to makeshift detention facilities, schools, warehouses, abandoned barracks where they awaited more formal classification. Their shaved heads made escape nearly impossible, ensuring they remained identifiable for weeks. In Czechoslovakia and Poland, the consequences were far harsher. The expulsions that began in May 1945 and intensified through the summer swept up millions of ethnic Germans. Women who had been publicly humiliated were often marched directly into detention camps designated for deportation. Conditions inside these camps varied widely, but many were overcrowded, undersupplied, and racked with disease. The humiliation they endured outside in the square continued within the walls, where guards and fellow detainees treated them as embodiments of the defeated regime. Their hair, slowly growing back, served as a continuing reminder of their marked status. In Soviet-occupied zones, the consequences carried an even darker dimension. German female auxiliaries captured in East Prussia, Silesia, and Eastern Germany were often transported to internment camps or repurposed labor facilities. The Soviet Union, devastated by German invasion, demanded reparations not only in material goods but also in forced labor. Tens of thousands of German women, both civilians and former auxiliaries, were assigned to labor brigades tasked with rebuilding infrastructure, clearing rubble, and working in factories. The humiliation they had suffered in public squares was only the first stage of a longer punishment imposed by a nation seeking justice for immense wartime loss psychologically. The immediate aftermath left deep scars. Many German women experienced profound shame, depression, and isolation. Their shaved heads marked them socially and emotionally, creating barriers even among fellow prisoners. For auxiliaries who had served in structured military environments, the abrupt shift to captivity eroded their sense of identity. They had been part of a system that promised order and purpose. Now they were reduced to symbols of defeat, guilty by association regardless of personal actions. Some tried to hide their heads under scarves or hats, but these coverings were often torn away during inspections. The shame became inescapable. In several testimonies collected after the war, German women described avoiding mirrors for weeks, unwilling to face what had been done to them. Others recalled the whispers of fellow inmates, the laughter of guards, or the curious stares of civilians when they were marched through towns. Even after their hair grew back, they carried the memory of the humiliation with them, often for the rest of their lives. The consequences extended beyond the individual to the broader German population. News of these punishments spread rapidly through the shattered remnants of Germany, carried by returning refugees, released POWs, and whispered accounts crossing borders. Word of women being humiliated in public squares fueled fear and despair among German civilians, particularly women attempting to flee advancing armies. Some chose to surrender specifically to American or British forces to avoid falling into the hands of partisans or Soviet troops, hoping for more structured treatment. In Allied administrative offices, reports of head-shaving rituals reached military command, prompting debates about how to handle both the victims and the crowds. American and British officers were concerned that, unchecked, civilian reprisals would destabilize liberated regions and undermine the rule of military law. In several towns, Allied troops intervened, dispersing crowds and taking women into custody before punishments could escalate. Nevertheless, the damage had already been done. The photographs and film footage captured during these events, images of shorn women paraded through streets, became emblematic of the chaotic transition from war to peace. Politically, the humiliation had ripple effects. In France, the phenomenon contributed to the formation of an official narrative about cleansing the nation of collaborators, a narrative later softened by historians who recognized the excesses of the Operation Sauvage. In Czechoslovakia, the treatment of German women became entwined with the larger expulsion of the Sudeten Germans, a process that remains controversial to this day. The public punishments reflected the desire of liberated communities to assert sovereignty, reclaim national identity, and visibly break with the hated past, yet the consequences were not uniform. Some German women eventually returned home, their humiliation becoming a private family memory, hidden from public discussion. Others never recovered socially or emotionally, carrying the stigma into the Reconstruction era of the 1950s and beyond. In the newly divided Germany, their treatment became a sensitive subject. In the West, it clashed with efforts to rebuild democratic values while acknowledging Nazi crimes. In the East, it was overshadowed by Soviet narratives of victory and retribution from the perspective of the communities that had carried out the humiliations. The immediate aftermath often brought a sense of release. Many civilians believed they had participated in a necessary act of national purification. For them, the sight of German women stripped of their hair symbolized the restoration of dignity after years of occupation. But as the months passed and stability returned, some began to question the justice of these acts. Quiet remorse appeared in diaries and letters, though rarely publicly acknowledged. In the broader context of the war, the aftermath of these events reflected the chaotic process of transition from conflict to peace. The humiliation of German women was one of countless consequences of the violence that had engulfed Europe. It highlighted the fragility of order in the face of collective trauma and the ease with which justice could blur into vengeance. The war had ended, but its emotional momentum lingered, shaping the lives of the prisoners and the liberated alike. As Europe struggled to rebuild, the memories of these humiliations were carried silently through streets now being pieced back together. For the women who had been shorn, the world after the war was not a clean beginning. It was a continuation of loss, personal, national, and moral. And as the dust began to settle across a continent scarred by conflict, people began to reflect on what these acts had meant and what they revealed about the fragile boundary between justice and cruelty. In the quiet years that followed the war, as Europe rebuilt its shattered cities and nations sought to reclaim stability, the memory of German women being humiliated marched into town squares, surrounded by jeering crowds, and shorn of their hair lingered like a faint scar across the continent's conscience. These events, though overshadowed by the enormity of the war's devastation, remained part of the complex emotional aftermath of a conflict that had consumed millions of lives. Now, with the guns silent and the armies disbanded, the world began to reflect on what these public rituals had meant not just to the women who endured them, but to the societies that carried them out, and to the broader historical arc of a war that reshaped global understanding of justice, vengeance, dignity, and humanity. Europe's reconstruction forced nations to confront uncomfortable truths. In France, scholars and citizens began to re-examine the phenomenon of l'épuration sauvage, the wild purge that had swept through liberated towns. At first, many had viewed the humiliation of women as a necessary cleansing, a symbolic way to erase the stain of occupation. But as time passed, a more nuanced understanding emerged. Historians uncovered the complexity of collaboration, the coercion many women faced, and the chaotic moral landscape of wartime survival. What had seemed like justice in the heat of liberation began to appear, in hindsight, as something more ambiguous, a mix of righteous anger and uncontrolled vengeance, carried out in a moment when law and morality had momentarily blurred. In Czechoslovakia and other Central European nations, the forced shaving of German women became woven into the larger historical debate about the expulsions that followed the war. These expulsions, which displaced millions of ethnic Germans, sparked decades of reflection about the boundaries between collective guilt and individual innocence. The humiliation of women, often carried out publicly and violently, came to symbolize the broader moral complexity of punishing a population for the crimes of a regime. Their suffering challenged simplified narratives of victim and perpetrator, highlighting the complicated reality that even those affiliated with a conquering power could themselves become victims when the balance of power shifted. For the Soviet Union, the treatment of German female POWs became a rarely discussed but deeply symbolic aspect of wartime memory. The USSR's narrative of victory emphasized the crushing of fascism and the avenging of the horrors committed on Soviet soil. Within that story, the humiliation of German women was seldom mentioned openly. It was absorbed into a larger narrative of justified retribution. But in private testimonies and later historical accounts, The treatment of these prisoners revealed the psychological toll of a war fought with unparalleled brutality. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lost families to German occupation, often acted out of grief and rage rather than calculated cruelty. Yet as time passed, the recognition grew that such acts, while emotionally understandable, left behind moral questions that complicated the triumph of liberation for the German women themselves. The experience left lasting emotional and social marks. Many rarely spoke of it aloud. In post-war Germany, both East and West, their shaved heads had grown back, but the memory of the humiliation endured in silence. They returned to communities where everyone had their own war wounds, and their suffering was often minimized or overlooked. For some, the shame persisted into old age. For others, it became a quiet reminder of how swiftly war can strip away identity, dignity, and control. Only decades later, as academics began studying the gendered dimensions of war, did their stories begin to surface more prominently, offering insights into an aspect of the conflict that had long been relegated to the margins. On a broader historical scale, these events contributed to a deeper understanding of how societies behave in the fragile transition between oppression and liberation. They showed that when oppressive systems collapse, the impulse for immediate justice can overpower institutions, leading to acts driven more by emotion than by principle. They also revealed the symbolic power of the human body in moments of political transformation. The shaving of women's hair, an act repeated across multiple countries, demonstrated how femininity itself becomes a battleground for national identity during times of war. The humiliation inflicted on these women reflected a cultural understanding that their bodies represented both personal betrayal and national shame. As Europe moved into the Cold War era, the humiliations became part of a quieter, more introspective moral reckoning. International law evolved, emphasizing the protection of prisoners, civilians, and non-combatants. The Geneva Conventions were expanded, influenced not only by the atrocities committed during the war, but also by the chaotic reprisals that followed. The world began to see that justice cannot be left to crowds fueled by collective trauma, and that even in victory, the abandonment of principles carries its own cost. In the realm of cultural memory, photographs and films of these events became historical artifacts, evidence of how liberation sometimes unleashed its own form of violence. These images appeared in museums, documentaries, and academic studies, provoking reflection rather than condemnation. Viewers saw the contrast between the joy of liberation and the cruelty embedded within its celebrations. They saw German women reduced to symbols, stripped not only of hair but of individuality. And they saw the complexity of human emotion in the faces of those carrying out the punishments: anger, relief, triumph, confusion, and sometimes regret. Ultimately, the legacy of these humiliations resides in the understanding that war blurs the boundaries between right and wrong, victim and perpetrator, justice and revenge. The women who endured this treatment lived at the intersection of these blurred lines. Their experiences offer a reminder that war's impact is not limited to battlefields or front lines. It extends into the intimate, the personal, the symbolic. It reshapes societies not only through destruction, but through the emotional and moral struggles that follow. In reflecting on these events, historians do not attempt to equate the suffering of German women with the vast atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. Instead, the aim is to understand the full spectrum of human behavior during times of upheaval. The humiliation of these women highlights how war fractures moral frameworks, how trauma can distort justice, and how individuals, no matter their affiliations, can become entangled in cycles of pain, power, and retribution. As Europe rebuilt itself from the ruins, these memories settled into the deeper fabric of history, cautionary tales about the dangers of collective rage, about the vulnerability of the human body in symbolic acts of punishment, and about the need for justice that is measured rather than impulsive. Today, their stories remind us that the end of a war is not the end of its consequences. The echoes of humiliation, like the echoes of violence, carry forward long after the crowds disperse and the scissors fall silent. And in that quiet reflection, we understand the final truth. History is not only shaped by generals and battles, but also by the overlooked moments in town squares where ordinary people, in extraordinary times, reveal the most complex dimensions of the human spirit.